Now, when she thinks back, Dede asks herself, as Minou has asked her, why? Why didn't she go along with her sisters? She was only 34. She could have started a new life. But no, she reminds herself, she wouldn't have started over. She would have died with them on that lonely mountain road. Even so, that night, her ears still ringing from Jaimito's shout, Dede had been ready to risk her life. It was her marriage that she couldn't put on the line. She had always been the docile middle child, used to following the lead. Next to an alto, she sang alto, by a soprano soprano. Miss Sonrisa, cheerful, compliant. Her life had gotten bound up with a domineering man, and so she shrank from the challenge her sisters were giving her. Dede sent Patria a note. Sorry. Jaimito says no. And for weeks afterwards, she avoided her sisters. And now, here they were, all three, like a posse come to rescue her. Dede's heart was beating away as she stood to welcome them. How wonderful to see you, she smiled, Miss Sonrisa, armed with smiles. She led them through the garden, delaying showing off this and that new planting, as if they were here on a social call, as if they had come to see how her jasmine shrubs were doing. They sat on the patio, exchanging the little news. The children were all coming down with colds. Little Jacqueline would be 1 in a month. Patria was up all hours again with Raulito. That boy was still not sleeping through the night. This gringo doctor she was reading said it was the parents of colicky babies who were to blame. No doubt Raulito was picking up all the tension in the house. Speaking of picking up things, Minou had called Trujillo a bad word. Don't ask. She must have overheard her parents. They would have to be more careful. Imagine what could happen if there were another spying yard boy like Prieto on the premises. Imagine. An awkward silence fell upon them. Dede braced herself. She expected Minerva to make an impassioned pitch for using the family farm for ammunition storage. But it was Mate who spoke up, the little sister, who still wore her hair in braids and dressed herself and her baby girl in matching dresses. They had come, she said, because something big, I mean really big, was about to happen. Mate's eyes were a child's, wide with wonder. Minerva drew her index finger across her throat and let her tongue hang out of her mouth. Patria and Mate burst into nervous giggles. They couldn't believe it. They'd gone absolutely mad. This is serious business, she reminded them. Some fury that had nothing to do with this serious business was making her heart beat fast. You bet it is, Minerva said, laughing. The goat is going to die. Less than 3 weeks. Mate's voice was becoming breathy with excitement. On the feast day of the Virgencita, Patria exclaimed, making the sign of the cross and rolling her eyes heavenward. Ay, Virgencita, watch over us. Dede pointed to her sisters. You're going to do it yourselves? Heavens, no, Mate said, horrified at the thought. The action group does the actual justice, but then all the different cells will liberate their locations. We'll be taking the Salcedo Fortaleza. Dede was about to remind her little sister of her fear of spiders, worms, noodles in her soup, but she let Mate go on. We're a cell, see? And there are usually only 3 in a cell, but we could make ours 4. Mate looked hopefully at Dede, as if they were inviting her to join a goddamn volleyball team. This is a little sudden, I know, Patria was saying, but it's not like with the boxes, Dede. This looks like a sure thing. This is a sure thing, Minerva confirmed. Don't decide now, Patria went on, as if afraid what Dede's snap decision might be. Think about it, sleep on it. We're having a meeting next Sunday at my place. I like old times, all 4 of us, Mate clapped her hands. Dede could feel herself being swayed by the passion of her sisters. Then she hit the usual snag. And Jaimito? There was another awkward silence. Her sisters looked at each other. Our cousin is also invited, Minerva said, with that stiff tone she always used with Jaimito. But you know best whether it's worth asking him. What do you mean by that? Dede snapped. I mean by that I don't know what Jaimito's politics are. Dede's pride was wounded. Whatever their problems, Jaimito was her husband, the father of her children. Jaimito's no Trujillista, if that's what you're implying, no more than Papa was. In his own way, Papa was a Trujillista, Minerva announced. All her sisters looked at her, shocked. Papa was a hero, that they fumed. He died because of what he went through in prison. You should know. He was trying to keep you out of trouble. Minerva nodded. That's right. His advice was always, don't annoy the bees, don't annoy the bees. It's men like him and Jaimito and other scared fulanitos who have kept the devil in power all these years. How can you say that about Papa? Dede could hear her voice rising. How can you let her say that about Papa? She tried to enlist her sisters. Mate had begun to cry. This isn't what we came for, Patria reminded Minerva, who stood and walked to the porch rail and stared out into the garden. Dede raked her eyes over the yard, half afraid her sister was finding fault there too. But the crotons were lusher than ever, and the variegated bougainvilleas she hadn't thought would take were heavy with pink blossoms. All the beds were neat and weedless, everything in its place. Only in the new bed, where she'd just been working, did the soil look torn up. And it was disturbing to see, among the established plantings, the raw brown earth like a wound in the ground. We want you with us. That's why we're here. Minerva's eyes, as she fixed them on her sister, were full of longing. What if I can't? Dede's voice shook. Jaimito thinks it's suicide. He's told me he'll have to leave me if I get mixed up in this thing. There, she'd said it. Dede felt the hot flush of shame on her face. She was hiding behind her husband's fears, bringing down scorn on him instead of herself. Our dear cousin, Minerva said sarcastically, but she stopped herself on a look from Patria. Everyone has their own reasons for the choices they make, Patria said, diffusing the charged atmosphere, and we have to respect that. Blessed are the peacemakers, Dede thought. But she couldn't for the life of her remember what the prize was that had been promised them. Whatever you decide, we'll understand, Patria concluded, looking around at her sisters. Mate nodded, but Minerva could never leave well enough alone. As she climbed in the car, she reminded Dede, next Sunday at Patria's around 3, in case you change your mind, she added. As she watched them drive away, Dede felt strangely mingled surges of dread and joy. Kneeling at the new bed helped calm the shaking in her knees. Before she had finished smoothing the soil and laying out a border of little stones, she had worked out her plan. Only much later did she realize she had forgotten to put any seeds in the ground. She would leave him. Next to that decision, attending the underground meeting over at Patria's was nothing but a small step after the big turn had been taken. All week she refined the plan for it. As she beat the mattresses and fumigated the baseboards for red ants, as she chopped onions for the boys' breakfast mango and made them drink limoncillo tea to keep away the cold going around, she plotted. She savored her secret, which tasted deliciously of freedom, as she allowed his weight on her in the dark bedroom and waited for him to be done. Next Sunday, while Jaimito was at his gallera, Dede would ride over to the meeting. When he came back, he would find the note propped on his pillow. I feel like I'm buried alive. I need to get out. I cannot go on with this travesty." Their life together had collapsed. From puppy-dog devotion, he had moved on to a moody bossiness, complicated with intermittent periods of dogged remorse that would have been passion had there been less of his hunger and more of her desire in it. True to her nature, that they had made the best of things, eager for order, eager for peace. She herself was preoccupied by the births of their sons, by the family setbacks after Papa was jailed, by Papa's sad demise and death, by their own numerous business failures. Perhaps Jaimito felt broken by these failures and her reminders of how she had tried to prevent them. His drinking, always social, became more solitary. It was natural to blame herself. Maybe she hadn't loved him enough. Maybe he sensed how someone else's eyes had haunted her most of her married life. Leo. What had become of him? Dede had asked Minerva several times, quite casually, about their old friend, but Minerva didn't know a thing. Last she'd heard, Leo had made it to Venezuela, where a group of exiles was training for an invasion. Then, recently, without her even asking, Minerva had confided to Dede that their old friend was alive and kicking. Tune in to Radio Rumbos, 99 on your dial. Minerva knew Jaimito would be furious if he found Dede listening to that outlawed station, yet her sister taunted her. One naughty night, Dede left Jaimito sleeping heavily after sex and stole out to the far end of the garden to the little shack where she kept the garden tools. There, in the dark, sitting on a sack of bark chips for her orchids, Dede had slowly turned the dial on Jaimito Enrique's transistor radio. The static crackled. Then a voice, very taken with itself, proclaimed, "Condemn me? It does not matter. History will absolve me." Fidel's speech was played endlessly at these off hours, as they soon found out. But night after night, she kept returning to the shack, and twice she was rewarded with the unfamiliar, blurry voice of someone introduced as Comrade Virgilio. He spoke his high-flown talk, which had never been what had appealed to Dede. Even so, night after night, she returned to the shed. For these excursions were what mattered now. They were her secret rebellion, her heart hungering, her little underground of one. Now, planning her exodus, Dede tried to imagine Leo's surprise at hearing that they had joined her sisters. He would know that she, too, was one of the brave ones. His sad, sober eyes that had hung before her mind's eye for so many years melted into the ones that looked back at her now from the mirror. I need to get out. I cannot go on with this travesty. As the day drew closer, Dede was beset by doubts, particularly when she thought about her boys. Enrique, Rafael, David, how could she possibly leave them? Jaimito would never let her keep them. He was more than possessive with his sons, claiming them as if they were parts of himself. Look at how he had named them all, with his first name as well as his last. Jaime Enrique Fernandez, Jaime Rafael Fernandez, Jaime David Fernandez. Only their middle names, which perforce became their given names, were their own. It wasn't just that she couldn't bear losing her boys, although that in itself was a dread large enough to stop her in her tracks. She also couldn't desert them. Who would stand between them and the raised hand when their father lost his temper? Who would make them mangoo the way they liked it, cut their hair so it looked right, and sit in the dark with them when they were scared, and the next morning not remind them she had been there? She needed to talk to someone outside her sisters. The priest. She'd gotten lax in her church attendance. The new militancy from the pulpit had become like so much noise in a place you had come to hear soothing music,